for that invitation, for that introduction, and for the invitation to present this workshop today. Today we'll be talking about how to do systematic reviews. There are 3 documents that I'd like you to download if you have not already done so. They're actually listed over on the left-hand side of your screen. One of these is an article that pretty much summarizes most of what we'll be talking about today, a how-to article that we published a year ago. The second is a handout of the slides, and the third is an article that I published in JAMA 2 years ago that we'll be discussing. You can also mention you can follow me on Twitter if you like. I'm just getting started with Twitter. What are we going to do today? 3 things. First, we're going to talk a little bit about why you might want to do a systematic review in the first place. Then we'll talk a little bit about the process of conducting a systematic review. And then we'll conclude by talking about how to report a systematic review, and with some thinking along the lines of how to appraise a report that you're reading, as well as kind of how to critique your own work. As we go through this, do please raise your hand or type questions if they come up. I like this to be an interactive workshop, and it's a little harder with the webinar where I can't see you and you can't shout at me to get my attention, but please do send in your questions, and we'll take those as we can. So first of all, why would we want to do a systematic review in the first place? And I'll give you a hint, it's not a quick path to publication. In fact, a well-done systematic review is extremely difficult, can be very time-consuming, very complex, arduous process, not a quick path to publication. It's fun, it's rewarding, it's interesting, you can learn a lot, and you can make a significant contribution to the field, but it's not easy. And Kevin Eva talked a little bit about this as well when he talked about the limits of systematicity and pointed out some of the shortcomings of systematic reviews. And that prompted me to respond with an article a few months later on narrowing the focus and broadening horizons. And basically, this article touched on the strengths and weaknesses of systematic reviews versus non-systematic reviews. And want to spend a little bit of time thinking about that. Why would you perhaps not want to do a systematic review? I like to make the analogy with original research studies. And when we think about that very broadly, one way to classify original research studies is quantitative and qualitative. And I suspect most of you are familiar with quantitative and qualitative research paradigms. And they really are fundamentally different in just about every aspect. The purpose of quantitative research is to usually to confirm a hypothesis to confirm a hypothesis or to quantitatively evaluate something to determine whether it worked. Qualitative research typically is more open-ended, trying to understand a process behind the scenes, to understand hidden agendas, unspoken values, things that aren't fully understood, to understand theory that's not yet been articulated clearly. Very different purposes. The classic design for a quantitative research study might be a randomized trial. For a qualitative study might be grounded theory. The selection process for quantitative research, you want to sample broadly, and if you can't get everyone involved, then you want to ideally do a random sample, whereas for qualitative research, you're very selective in the people that you enroll in the study, and you might even only select 2 or 3 people from each representative element of the study population, so that you can get different perspectives and different insights, and so on and so forth down the line. And when we think about this with systematic reviews versus non-systematic reviews, essentially literature reviews in general, we see a very similar parallel. The purpose in a systematic review is typically to confirm a hypothesis and to summarize very succinctly a large body of work. Non-systematic reviews tend to be more inductive, looking for novel insights to generate hypotheses about a field. The classic design for a systematic review would be a meta-analysis. For a non-systematic review, it would be a critical synthesis. The selection process would vary. For systematic reviews, you want to be very comprehensive, very clear on your inclusion and exclusion criteria. If it doesn't meet your inclusion criteria, no matter how interesting, you really can't include it, at least not in your original review. You might comment on it in the introduction or the discussion, but you're very restricted by definition. You have inclusion criteria. For a non-systematic review, you can include pretty much any article you like, any article that has bearing, sheds insights, or sheds light on the question can be included. The analysis for a systematic review would be a test of statistics like meta-analysis, whereas for qualitative non-systematic reviews, you do more of a narrative synthesis. And for a systematic review, we're looking often at a single number or a series of numbers, the results of our meta-analyses. Attribution of differences between those studies is considered error. If the studies don't all come up with the same result, we want to understand why they didn't come up with the same result, because we think in theory that they should come up with the same result. Whereas in a non-systematic review, we actually highlight and capitalize on those differences, because they might suggest areas, novel insights, areas for further exploration, and so forth. Not to say you can't do that in a systematic review as well, but the emphasis is different. Validity in a systematic review it largely focuses on the homogeneity among the studies and the rigor of your methods. For a non-systematic review, you want to have multiple concordant sources. And I won't. I'll stop there. But you get the idea that there's strengths and weaknesses to both approaches, and you may, as you think about your research question, decide ultimately that you don't really want to do a systematic review. I think I'll pause there and just ask, are there any questions up to this point? You can type in your questions. I'll pause for a few seconds and let you do that. Otherwise, we'll move on to the process. All right, I'm not seeing any questions, so I think we'll proceed. So here in 6 easy steps is described the process of conducting a systematic review. And I'll go over each of these steps in turn. But I want to emphasize 2 points. First of all, you need to have a written protocol. A high quality review will have a written protocol. It doesn't need to be long. It can only be a page or 2 long. It doesn't have to be 10 or 12 pages, but you want to have written down your plan to address each of the steps here. You want to write down your focused question. You want to write down your search strategy and your inclusion and exclusion criteria. Outline at least roughly the elements of data abstraction, and plan your data analysis. This is really important, and many journals will ask you to submit your systematic review protocol at the time of submission, and it's good to be prepared to be able to do that. The other point I want to emphasize again, not to belabor the point, is after you've articulated your question, you should really consider, do I want to do a systematic review at all? Or should I do some other type of review? Or should I maybe abandon this altogether because it's just not the most relevant thing to be doing right now? But I'm not going to come back and talk about those 2 points again, so I wanted to get those out of the way. First of all, first step, you need to define a focused question. And I think about this using the PICO format. If you're clinicians, you may be familiar with this. In evidence-based medicine, we talk about the PICO question as defining the population, the intervention, the comparison, the outcome, and in this case also the design. So a focused question might say that among medical students, is simulation-based training for pediatric advanced life support in comparison with non-simulation based training effective at improving skills and behaviors of the bedside, and we might restrict this to randomized controlled trials, or we might include all comparative studies, or we might also want to even look at qualitative research and so forth. You can do systematic reviews of qualitative research studies. So you want to have a focused question. And you also often will have a hypothesis. As you define your question, you may hypothesize, for example, that simulation will improve skills in comparison with non-simulation instruction because by giving people hands-on practice, they'll be better prepared to do that task when given the opportunity. So that would be a hypothesis you might state. And it's good to get that hypothesis articulated as well. It keeps you scientifically rigorous. Next step, you want to identify a team. This is one of the most important steps in a place where people can easily fall down. As Indiana Jones did, you need to choose wisely. A few things that might help you in your choosing. First, you want to have people that are willing to work hard and stick to timelines. That's one of the first things that I try to explore when I assemble my teams. Is someone going to come through with the deadlines that we set? Are they going to have the capacity to put forth a full effort and meet the timeline and deadline that we've set as a team? But you also want to select for diversity. The last thing you want is to have everyone on your team think alike. You don't want groupthink. You want differences of opinion. Now, you have to be careful here. If you get opinions that are too widely divergent, then you're never able to come to consensus. And we'll talk about that later, but there's lots of places where you need to come to consensus. But the selecting for diversity, diversity of experiences, diversity of specialty, diversity of training. I often try to get a PhD on my team because they have a different insight on research. You also may want to select for specific experiences with systematic reviews. I'd strongly encourage you, if you've never done a systematic review, to try to find one person to join your team who has done systematic reviews so that they can kind of help you get down that road for the very first time. As with any research project, it's helpful to have a mentor. And finally, you may want to select for some specific skills. Most notably, you may want to go out of your way to find a research librarian to join your team. The research librarian can help you with your search strategy, most importantly, and also help keep you honest on some of the other issues. Mark's asked a question here, what approach should we take when the question is narrow and the data are sparse in pediatric environments? I think now's as good a time as any to answer that question. And I guess my response would be it depends on what you're trying to study. It depends on your question. If your question is something about education and about training, medical students or residents or nurses, I would like to assume, it may not be entirely true, but like to assume that medical students going into would learn the same whether they're on a pediatric rotation or an adult medicine rotation or a surgery rotation, that pediatric residents learn fundamentally the same as internal medicine residents. And so from an education standpoint, it's quite likely that the educational differences, the educational approaches don't matter a whole lot. Now, that's not going to be perfectly true. There are obviously some unique things in pediatrics that don't apply in adult medicine and vice versa, but to the degree that those are clinically important tasks as compared with educationally important aspects of the training, it's likely that the educational principles will be the same. So it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. But if what you're trying to accomplish is for example, a systematic review of a clinical topic, then adult medicine may not be very relevant. If you're trying to do a systematic review of pediatric training, then you really could ask the question, is there any good reason not to also include adult medicine trainees when answering the same question? And that's a judgment call, but it would be a reasonable thing if the evidence is sparse in pediatrics to expand to similar training activities in another non-pediatric specialty. All right. Any other questions? Did that make sense? Did that answer your question, Mark, or anything to follow up there? Great. So moving on. So after we've assembled the team and hopefully gotten on board a research librarian, we need to come up with our literature search. And I divide the literature search into two broad questions. First of all, what are going to be your information sources? What databases are you going to search? Medline is the one that often comes first to mind, but there are others like Embase and CINAHL and PsycInfo and ERIC and Web of Science and Scopus, all different databases. These have substantial overlap, but they don't overlap entirely. So Medline and Embase overlap about 80%, but that means that 20% is going to be different. And Scopus adds an additional 20%, and CINAHL adds another 10%, and PsycInfo adds another 20%. So, as you expand these databases and consider which ones might be relevant to your question, you want to be as parsimonious as you can, but you also want to make sure you have the right databases selected. It's often helpful to look through your own files. You might ask experts in the field to look through their files to identify what they feel are the most important studies in the field. You might want to also hand search the bibliography of included articles. This is a practice that I follow and tends to give us another maybe 8 to 10% of studies that we've missed through our search terms can be identified by searching the bibliographies. So that's the first step, is the information sources. The second is to define your search terms. And this is where you really need the help of a research librarian. Often you'll want to use mesh headings. Mesh terms are the Medline terms that articles are indexed by. Unfortunately for education, the mesh headings don't work very well, so you'll often be using keyword searches and trying to combine those in creative ways to focus down on your topic. What this means in practical terms is, because education search terms aren't very well defined, you have to cast a very broad net. In our systematic review of simulation-based research, we found 11,000 studies, and from that we had to narrow down. So the only way we could encompass all the studies was to cast a very broad net. Now, sometimes you'll think about restrictions to this data set. So after you've identified a study, are there ways to focus down and get rid of a few of the studies right out of the gate? Sometimes people will focus by time. So they'll say any study more than 10 years old or any study more than 20 years old is no longer relevant, and I will exclude those. That's a judgment call, depends on your research question. You want to be careful doing that, because a peer reviewer might subsequently disagree with you and think that that was an important thing to not do. Some people exclude non-English language. I think that's generally a mistake. There's a lot of excellent work published in non-English literature, and just because the person who did the research doesn't happen to speak my language doesn't mean it's not good quality work. So I tend to try very hard to include non-English work. Fortunately, translation is a lot easier now than it was even 5 years ago, and I've found very good success using tools like Google Translate to help me as I'm using non-English language primary sources, at least for the screening process. Usually when it comes to data abstraction, I will try as hard as I can to get the full text translated by a professional translator, or at least by a native speaker. But for screening purposes, Google Translate can work very well trying to decide whether a study should be included. And at least then you're not spending your time and money and resources translating articles that aren't relevant. And the third is the gray literature. This is things like PhD theses, your master's theses, or abstracts presented at conferences but never published. The gray literature has not been peer reviewed. That's why it's called gray. It's kind of in limbo. It's never been put under the full scrutiny of the peer review process. But at the same time, some people think that it adds value, and a lot of negative studies never get published because their p-values don't reach statistical significance. And so there's arguments for and against inclusion of the gray literature. As a general rule, If if I've got a lot of studies, I may exclude gray literature. If the number of studies I'm including is rather small, I will expand my search to include certain aspects of the gray literature, although I often don't get to the point of including meeting abstracts, and the reason for that is because it's simply too hard to identify all of the relevant possible abstracts at all of the possible meetings, and so I just draw a line in the sand. But some people do try to do that. And finally, last but not least, make sure to get assistance from an expert such as a librarian or someone experienced with conducting literature searches. Um, so once you've identified the articles, you may have 100, you may have 1,000, you may have 10,000 articles. Now you need to decide which ones are included or excluded. And for this, you go back to your research question and define very clearly the studies that you'll want to include. You want to come up with very specific inclusion criteria. So for my review, we took all studies that were original research. So we excluded editorials and essays and other review articles that had to do with simulation-based education. And we had to define simulation-based education. What was that? How could we recognize that? What would not be simulation-based education? We had to say that another inclusion criterion was health professions, trainees, and what was a health professional? Was a social worker a health professional? Was a desk clerk or a secretary a health professional, and so forth. Yeah, you have to come up with these very specific criteria, write them down, and then you're going to want to pilot test these in a sample of 10 to 20 or 30 articles just to see how they fly. And you'll find that even with just looking at 5 or 10 articles, you'll find a lot of areas, gray zones that need to be defined, and you'll want to more carefully focus down on what your criteria are. And as you pilot test the form, you'll revise the form, but you'll also come up with examples and non-examples of what should and should not come in. You want to keep that document you want to document each of those decisions, each of those decisions. Now, you want to do the inclusion and exclusion process in 2 stages, usually done in duplicate, 2 different people looking at each article. The first stage is to look at titles and abstracts. And here I tend to just err on the side of inclusion. If the title and abstract aren't clear, instead of asking a collaborator, well, what do you think? Is this title, does this should come in, or this abstract, what do you think? I just say, if it's not clear, then I turf it to the next step, because it's really hard to make good judgment calls based on the limited information in an abstract. And if I have a hard time reading that abstract and making a decision, it's not very probable that another person on my team is going to come up with any better decision based on that limited amount of information. So it's better to just turf it forward, get the full text of the article, read that full text, and then make that decision. So that's the second stage, is the full text review. And there, in the full text review, you have to get the articles and review them all again in duplicate. And this time, there's no margin for error. So you have to make a concrete decision. Should this study be included? Should it be excluded? And if you disagree, then you have to reconcile your differences, or perhaps even appeal to a third person to help you make that decision. I see someone's typing, so I'll wait for that question. Does one person have to read all the articles, or is it done by committee? That depends on how you define your review process. In some reviews, I've been kind of a gold standard, and I've read all the articles, and then my team would each do a subset. Other times, we've divided up the work, and everybody on the team takes a portion, and but one person doesn't necessarily read all of them. In a small review, 2 people can do this alone. In our large review, we had 6 or 7 people working together, each taking a chunk. So in the systematic review in JAMA, the one that we're going to discuss in a moment, I did not ever read all of the articles. About a third of them I never read. That means I read over 600 articles. I think I read about 700 in the end. So still an awful lot, but there were 300, maybe 350 that I never read. So I think that answers your question, Steve. Is that okay? Okay, so let's talk just briefly about reconciling differences. So again, first of all, stage one of inclusion-exclusion, you don't try to reconcile differences. If there's a disagreement, you just turf it forward and deal with it at the second phase. But in the second phase of inclusion-exclusion and also with data abstraction, you do have to reconcile differences. And here's what I've found works best. First of all, don't jump to the third-party arbitrator. First, try to resolve them amongst the two reviewers who had that conflict initially. Couple of reasons for that. First, you're the ones that understand the issue. Second, no reason to waste someone else's time. And third, as you explore these in greater detail, you'll come to understand at a deeper level, perhaps there's something with your inclusion or exclusion criteria that needs to be changed, that something's unclear, and if you just go to the third party, you might mask over some of those important changes that could help to your review to evolve and improve. Second tip, I rather than jump on the phone or meet in person to resolve all the differences, I've learned that it's a lot more efficient to have one person go back through all the differences and resolve as many as he or she can on their own. I found that a lot of times you can get 50% or 60% of the problems resolved right out of the gate by the first person going back through and saying, "Oh yeah, I agree with that. Oh yeah, I agree with that. Oh yeah, I agree with that," and then you're done. After that, after the first reviewer has gone back through, then they send their what the uh, existing differences, the differences still exist off to the second reviewer, and that second reviewer goes through the same thing. And by the end of that second review, you've usually already reconciled about 90% of your conflicts. Then you gather for the last 10% and you meet face to face or by telephone and you discuss and you resolve those last few differences by phone, and only the few that you cannot come to agreement on after a verbal discussion do you turf up to the third party arbitrator. And usually in a large review, I find that that's less than 1% of the decisions. So in our of the of the 2,000 articles that made it through to level 2 inclusion exclusion, I think we only had to have about 5 out of 2,000 that trickled down and required third-party arbitration. The other thing I'd point out with reconciling differences is to make use of electronic tools. We often use an Excel spreadsheet for this, and we can leave comments for one another. We can color code the differences. So, one color means I agree with you. The other one means I really don't have a clue. The other one means I agree with myself, but I think you're wrong. Things like that. So, these make use of these electronic tools. Next step is data abstraction. What data are you going to extract from each article? You want to be systematic about this. You want to try to get the same information from every article. And when you're doing a large review, you don't want to go back and have to do it 2 or 3 times. You don't want to read every article 3 times. So you want to get that data extracted the first time through. How do you do that? Well, the first thing to think about is your research question. Make sure that you extract the information needed to answer your research question. Second, I encourage you to think about the PICO format. Who's the population? Who are your participants and how many of them were there? What's the intervention? What are the key features of that intervention? What is the comparison? And what are the key features of the comparison? And especially important, what's the difference between the intervention and the comparison? I often code that separately. What are the outcomes? What are the characteristics of how those were measured? Was it blinded? Were the outcomes done in duplicate? How were they measured, and so forth? And then the study design features, randomized controlled trials, follow-up, blinding, so forth, are all issues related to the design. You want to abstract the results. What was one? Which intervention was better, the intervention or the comparison? How much better or how much worse or how much the same were they? What was the p-value? What was the difference between the two groups? Those are the results you want to abstract. And then the methodological quality, usually helpful to get an instrument that's recognized as you go through that to make sure that you're complete. The Mirsky and the Newcastle Ottawa scale are two that I've used and I think work fairly well for this. After you've identified the elements of your data abstraction, you've come to agreement on that, then you can develop your data abstraction form, and here you want to really pilot test this well. As I said, you don't want to go back and have to recode all of the articles a second or third time. So what I encourage you to do is review 2 or 3 articles, see how the form works, review another 5 or 10 after that, see how the form works, reconcile differences, get together as a team, clarify ambiguities, and then I do at least a third step of pilot testing where we would review another 10 or 15 articles and again come together as a team to reconcile and to resolve differences and clarify ambiguities. Usually after 3 pilot tests, we're ready for full go, but sometimes it even requires a 4th round of pilot testing. As you go through the as you go through the review process, even if you have a fixed data abstraction form, you're going to come up with places where you're not sure how to code something. And every time you do that, you're going to make a decision as a team, and you're going to then need to write that down and document it so that these operational definitions, these definitions that are developed in real time, are captured so that later on at the end of when you write this up, you can correctly represent all of those decisions. As you go through data abstraction and also sometimes with the inclusion-exclusion process, there's a lot of tools that can help you. Some people still do reviews with paper, but that's quickly becoming outdated. Excel is often used for moderate-sized reviews. For a large review, such as the one that we did, we required a purpose-built review management software tool called Distiller, and I'll show you a slide on the next. I'll show you a picture on the next slide. Other things that I find useful during the review process, things like email, instant messaging, teleconferences, Skype are helpful. We had a Google group that would allow us to send messages back and forth and have all those messages archived. Google Docs is very helpful. That's where we kept our operational criteria so that as we added to the operational criteria, everyone was instantly able to access the most recent document. Sometimes even something like scheduling software like Doodle or Meeting Wizard can be helpful as you're trying to identify common times when everyone on your team can meet. This is a picture of Distiller, shows how it keeps track of different individuals and how many articles that they've reviewed, and also shows a form that you can complete online, and it automatically keeps track of how many reviews a given article has had, and allows you to download that data for subsequent analysis. Very helpful, but it is an expensive subscription, so it will require resources to use. And last but not least is the analysis. And some people tend to gloss over this, but I think it's probably one of the most difficult and probably the least understood part of the entire process. People, as a general rule, don't do a good job of synthesis. What people often do instead of synthesis is what I call a litany of the literature, where they say the study by Jones et al. Found this, and the study by Fitzgerald found this, and the study by Hancock found this, and the study by Sawyer found this, and the study by Cook found this, and the study by Youngblood found this, and it's just one after another after another. That is not a synthesis. Please do not do that. If you do that and your article crosses my desk, I will send it right back to you for further analysis. An analysis really requires you to get into the articles and understand the articles and then distill out some key messages that will be useful to the reader of the article. And you really have to put yourselves in the place of the reader and say, if I were reading this review, what would I want to know? What is the key message that can be distilled out from this vast body of work that I've now identified and abstracted data on? What's the key message, or what are the key messages that I could share with the world? You want to organize this information. You want to interpret the studies. You want to give people a bottom line. You want to identify weaknesses in the literature, inconsistencies or heterogeneity between studies, and gaps, places where the literature falls short of its potential and places for future research. So this all requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of effort to do a good synthesis. Again, the last thing you want to do is the litany of the literature. You might want to do a quantitative summary, such as a meta-analysis, but meta-analysis is not required in a systematic review. Systematic review is, by definition, the use of systematic methods to identify and include or exclude studies. That's what a systematic review is. Data abstraction is also part of a systematic review, but analysis is not. Analysis can be done in many ways, and you can even do a critical synthesis or a narrative synthesis of the articles identified in a systematic review. And with that, I will pause for questions. Any questions up to this point? Okay, I don't see anyone typing. What I want to do next then is to give you a chance to look at this article that we published in JAMA 2 years ago. And as you read through, I'd ask you to especially focus on the methods section. And I want you to see how we went through each of these steps. We don't clearly have to talk about the team, but we talk about everything else, the question and all the other things. I want you to read through that and see what we did, why we did it, what are some of the decisions that we made, how did we justify those decisions, and then most importantly, what questions remain in your mind after you're done. So again, I'm going to set a timer here for 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, we'll come back and continue. And the last 15 minutes of the presentation will be spent. We'll talk about how to report your systematic review. If you do have questions that come up as you're going through, go ahead and type them in and I can respond to those. But again, I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes and then I'll continue the presentation. Okay, so trim and fill. Um, so trim and fill is has to do with meta-analysis. It's something that I don't really, I'm not really able to get into depth. I actually have some additional slides. If we have time at the end, I will answer that question. It's a meta-analytic technique that basically allows you to fudge the data and make a rough guess as to what the estimate might have been if unpublished studies had been published. But it's fraught with difficulty. It actually is essentially a horrible way to do it, but there's nothing better. So people try to do it as a way to get a rough estimate of what the meta-analysis might have looked like if unpublished studies had in fact been published. Um, and again, I have a slide on that at the end. If there's time, I can show you that. Any other questions, comments, things that you learned, things that you struggled with as you were reading through the methods section here? See, Steve's typing another question here, so I'll wait for that. So Steve says there are lots of assumptions along the way. Uh, some of these are predictable. Mostly a case of dealing with unexpected things that come up. Um, so you know, a mixture of both, I guess. Most of the decisions that we made up front. That's part of writing your protocol, and that's part of what comes from having done this and having the experience to know, to be able to anticipate some of the problems before they occur. So we, for example, decided to include as many studies as we could. We decided to do hand searches. We decided to not look at the gray literature. We did that in advance. But then as we identified 985 articles, we said, well, we can't hand search the bibliography of 985 articles. So we did some strategic random sampling to identify subsets of articles and review those. And so instead of doing 985, we wound up doing, I think, like 130. So that was one way that we responded to something on the fly, just as an example. But for the most part, we try to anticipate as much as possible, and some of that comes just from experience. Lillian asks, is there any way to know if your question is relevant and appropriate? What if your question or outcome changes slightly as you do the search? So first part, the best way to know if your question is relevant and appropriate is to ask other people what they think of your question. That's one reason to get a good team together, a team with a diverse set of perspectives, and that's going to be very helpful. You might run the question past other leaders in the field, people not involved in your study. You could go up to someone at a national conference, show them your question, ask them what they think. Perhaps the most important thing to do to know if your question is relevant is to do a literature search and identify other reviews. I get to this in the reporting, and we'll talk about that in the next slide, but one of the best things to do is to look and see what other reviews have been published on this topic. If there's another review that does an acceptable job on this, then you may not want to duplicate that. If there's another review that asks the same question, but that was a horrible review, or you feel like you can contribute substantially above and beyond what that set of authors did, that might be a great question, because obviously the question was important enough to have one article published on it. It's quite natural for the question and the outcomes to change slightly as you do the search. You'll refine your search a little bit, and sometimes it can be an iterative process to refine your question and outcomes. once you get into the inclusion and exclusion, you probably better start having a fairly focused question. You don't want to go back and change it at that point. And once you're halfway through data abstraction, that would be a bad time to start to really be changing your question. Other than, I mean, you can wordsmith it, but I wouldn't change it at a fundamental level. Let's see. Mark is asking, in creating the data abstraction form, should authors aim to adapt one from the literature? What you do when you recognize you need to revise your form late in the review process. People don't often publish their data abstraction forms. I don't publish mine as a general rule. I'd be willing to share one with you if you needed one as a model. But the most important thing is we don't actually use the data abstraction forms themselves to code the data. We use that as to generate our I use those to I use my data abstraction form to actually generate an electronic form, and those are very idiosyncratic, study specific, in other words. If you need to revise your form late in the review process, that does happen. Happens pretty much every time for me, unfortunately, despite my best intentions. You basically have to modify the form in some way and go back and recode all those articles. And that's a lot of work, and especially if you're doing it towards the end of the review, which is why you want to do as much of the identification up front, with your pilot testing and conceptualizing and discussing with your team, so you don't have to go back and redo a lot of reviewing and reread 100 articles again. Let's see, how did your group divide up the workload for data abstraction process? Did the ICCs represent all the authors coding all included articles? Yes, ICC. The nice thing about an ICC, interclass correlation coefficient, is essentially the same as a kappa, but the way it's calculated, you can have multiple different people, multiple different participants included in those analyses. We use general linear models to do those analyses. So we divided up the workload based on workload capacity. If someone said I can do 10%, then we would assign them 10%. If someone said I can do 30%, we would assign them 30%. If someone said I can do 60%, we'd assign them 60%. And the review software that we used allowed us to do that, and it automatically kept track of who had done how many articles and which articles they had reviewed and so forth. Then the ICCs are basically an average across all of those articles, all of those authors, with weighting according to how much they contributed. All right. I don't see any of the other people talking. I hope I answered those questions satisfactorily. I'd like to spend the last remaining time, we got about 7 minutes, quickly going through some salient points of reporting. First and foremost, I'd encourage people to look at the standards for reporting. The most recent standards are the PRISMA, the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses. It's free online, and I'd encourage you to read through that and understand that as you go to write up your report, and probably even at the planning stages when you're writing your protocol. It's a good idea to make sure that you are collecting information along the way to allow you to report it at the end. As we go through the next few slides, you may just glance at that JAMA article to see how we reported things. So we'll spend about 1 minute on each slide here. First of all, the introduction. The introduction should be very brief, usually 2, at most 3 paragraphs, and focus on the work and the findings of previous review articles. And where did those review articles fall short, and what do they leave open to question? Don't talk about individual original research studies. That's the whole point of your review. So don't spend time in the introduction talking about the articles you'll be talking about later on. Instead, talk about previous reviews, because those reviews are what will define whether or not there's room in the field for your review. If there's 3 other good reviews on this topic, your review as number 4 is probably not going to contribute very much. If the previous 3 reviews were horrible, or failed to, or if they missed an entire field of the entire part of the field, then you'd want to highlight that and say there are 3 previous reviews, but each of them had limitations. Our study is going to address those limitations and fill this huge gap. Therefore, our review will make a contribution to the field. That's the introduction. Be brief and highlight previous reviews. Second, the methods. Describe each step of the process as we described previously, and I encourage you to use separate headings. I like to use headings in my write-ups because it helps people organize their thinking. It helps me organize my thinking. It helps people who are reading to follow along. Uh, Not going to talk more about the methods because that's what we just talked about. The results. You need to have a study flow diagram. I'll show one on the next slide. You want to report the study characteristics, the study quality, and then the synthesis. And again, I make use of headings so that people can know what we're talking about at each part of the manuscript. You're going to need at least 2 tables. One table will list all of the studies with relevant with some of the most important or most salient data. So for example, the participants, the sample size, the study design, key features of the intervention, the comparison, key features of the outcome, and so forth. You'll usually also want a second table showing the quality of all the studies. In a small systematic review, you'd want to have both of these tables in the full text. In a large review like ours, we made it part of the appendix and then presented summary tables in the results. But say if I only had a review of 30 or 40 studies, I'd probably list all those studies in table 1 and list all those studies again for table 2 with the quality metrics. Then you may need some figures showing your meta-analysis results. You may want a figure or a table showing the main themes that emerged from your critical synthesis, or maybe even a conceptual framework that you generate based on your synthesis. But again, remember in your results to synthesize. And let's see, so here's a picture of a flow diagram. These are shown in the PRISM standards. I want to spend just one more second talking about synthesis. The one thing that I find helpful as kind of a template for synthesis is to start off with the bottom line. As the first sentence in a paragraph would say, 8 studies looked at this issue and the bottom line is blank. And tell people what the bottom line is. Then use the next couple of sentences or the remainder of that paragraph to go through those 8 studies and show how those 8 studies in fact support what you stated at the outset. And you don't want to do them one at a time. You want to say 3 of these 8 studies found this, 5 of the 8 found this, 7 of the 8 found this, and in sum, this is what they show. So that's one way that I've found that is helpful for synthesis, and I share that with you in the article. The how-to article goes over that synthesis, and if you read my work, you can see how I try to do it. How I try to do that. Second to last section, the discussion. I break this down into 4 elements. First paragraph or 2 is the summary of what we found. This is just what we found. This is not what other people found. This is not my limitations. This is not the study by Jones et al. Found this and the study by Richardson found this. It is just what we found in our review, what is our contribution. Next, I put the limitations. I like to state the limitations and get them out of the way instead of trying to hide them towards the end. Third, the integration with previous reviews. This is where I begin to start other people's work. The other studies how does my study intersect, add, contribute to, build upon other work? And then I conclude with the implications, 2 or 3, maybe 4 paragraphs. What are some take-home points that people can use in practical terms or for next steps in research based on our findings? And those are my conclusions. So I do not need a separate conclusions paragraph or section because my implications are my conclusions. And if reviewers or editors say, well, we want you to have a conclusions paragraph, then I just rename my implications to conclusions and move on. But that's my discussion. And we're out of time, so very quickly, the abstract. I use a structured abstract, even if the journal won't allow you to use a structured abstract, to make sure that each of these elements is there, and then delete the heading if you need to for the journal to be happy. But make sure that you have all of this information in your structured abstract.